Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. What is a maeven? M-A-V-E-N. The Yiddish definition for this curiously popular fantasy fiction word that often is used to describe a senior sorceress, for example, derives from a Hebrew root, mevin, or meven, M-E-Y-V-N, that translates into English as an expert, a connoisseur, or a teacher. It could also be used as a reasonably good substitute for mentor, when it's used in a fantasy fiction sense by an author to describe witchcraftery. Because a maven is a trusted expert in a particular field, and in Yiddish that field is often things like freshness of fashion or society manners or underground or counterculture, then a maven is generally believed to be a female, and it's a female role, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. Social influences, who might be considered ahead of the curve, for example, might be described as mavens in Yiddish. Anyone who's teaching others about emerging trends, for example, is also a maven. Fantasy fiction synonyms would include diva, whiz, adept, savant, luminary, and futurist, all of which have myth and magic connotations, but that is what a maven is. What is an ash? You've seen, because you read fantasy fiction, words which have the A and E joined together. And this odd thing, if you want to know what it looks like, you'll have to go onto my show notes at neilmack, all one word, .me. A-E-S-C is pronounced ash, and it's the A and E letters joined together to create a new letter, and it's pronounced ash. In actual fact, its proper academic description is a diphthong ligature. Ligature, obviously, because it's tied together. So diphthong, you probably would want to know what diphthong is. Yes, it comes from the ancient Greek diphthongos, which means literally to double sound or double tone something. Diphthongs normally happen when two individual vowels sit alongside each other in the same word. They must be non-identical for diphthongos to work, so double O in foolish doesn't work. But O and A joined together, or A and E joined together, does create a double sound. The aish diphthong, which is the one I'm talking about now, has been promoted in status to become a standalone letter in some alphabets, including in the languages the Danish, Norwegian and Icelandic, all of which sound vaguely as if they are fantasy fiction languages. That's why using an ash in some of your words makes your language seem somehow medievalish. Instantly, medieval has got an ash in the middle of it because it's spelled M-E-D-I, ash, V-A-L. So some fantasy fiction words with diphthong ligatures in them that you might be tempted to use, and all of them except the last two I'm going to give you are ashes. The last two are still diphthongs, ligature diphthongs, but let's go through what you might be tempted to use. Anesthesia, archaeology, chimera, demon, which you see a lot, Daemon, enigma, Aenigma, fairy, hyena, medieval, which I've just mentioned, nymphi. In fact, the plural of that is also has a ligature. Paean, and don't mix this up with paeon, but paean is a sad ode, like a song. Phoenix, and my last one, questor, Quoestor. So that's what an ash is, and perhaps you'll be tempted to use it in your fantasy fiction.
Handelsmand, og jeg byder jer velkommen til denne her store dag for vores egen. I ved, at handlen ikke har været...
What is a peasant? I defined in a recent show a king, so I think it's only fair to define a peasant, Peasant. And anyway, it's also likely that you will want to include a bunch of peasants in your fantasy fiction, especially if you're setting your fantasy fiction story in the medieval period, also known as the Dark Ages. But what are peasants? And how would you describe a peasant in your novel? And were they as lowly and as crude and unwashed as you might think? So here's something to get you started. It's a story. In the spring of 1381, an angry mob of people descended on London. They crossed London Bridge and they handed a list of demands to the officials of the king that included a list of notable people such as Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and some key royal officials and other prominent people in the royal circle, and they demanded that these characters should be handed over to them for execution. To say the authorities were gobsmacked by this brazen effrontery is a bit of an understatement. So they told this furious crowd in no uncertain terms to bugger off. So the furious crowd destroyed Clerkenwell Priory because they hated knights. And Clerkenwell Priory was the British headquarters of the Crusaders known as the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Knights of Malta. Then they marched down Fleet Street to attack buildings in the Temple, which was another major Knights Hospitaller base, and they looted the offices of the Lord Privy Seal, who was one of the people on their blacklist, and they tore apart the house of the greatest nobleman who lived in medieval London at that time, and it was called the Savoy Palace. And they wandered further down Fleet Street and the Strand and freed some political prisoners from various jails that they came across, and they finally arrived at the Tower of London, which they surrounded. Inside the Tower of London, within the protective confines of this famous royal castle, the royal government was in a state of shock at these accelerated turn of events. The 14-year-old King Richard II of England, who was holed up in the tower with his advisors and his government ministers, considered that it might be a good idea to leave the castle's security and head to Mile End in East London, which is about a mile away, to negotiate with the mob. So he left the safety of the castle with a small detachment of armed bodyguards, and he travelled to Mile End. On the way to Mile End, several Londoners had the nerve and the gumption and the gall to accost His Majesty the King and to complain about the alleged injustices that they had suffered at the hands of his senior civil servants and his ministers. But the king got to Mile End, and when he met with the organisers of the protest, he offered to declare a royal charter that would immediately bring about the abolition of serfdom, which was one of their desires. And he said that this charter would take effect immediately, but during the negotiation, the king refused to deliver up any of the royal officials that they wanted executed, and he promised that he would instead implement whatever justice was required. Now, unknown to King Richard, while he was meeting these protesters, the Tower of London was overrun by part of the crowd. The famous gates had been opened, stupidly, to receive the king upon his return. So a smaller mob of around 400 protesters seized this opportunity to enter the fortress, apparently without resistance from any of the troops who were stationed inside. And one has to ask, were they sympathisers to the cause? And then the protesters began to hunt down key targets inside the Tower of London. Bearing in mind, don't forget, this is a royal palace. They went to hunt down key targets, including Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And so his job was to hoist taxes. And he was the person who was bringing in a thing which they all hated called the poll tax. They also hunted down Admiral Sir Robert Hales, Hales, who was the Grand Prior of the Knights Hospitaller in England and was also the Lord High Treasurer. So as far as they were concerned, he was also responsible for the poll tax. They found both these hiding in the chapel of the White Tower. So these VIPs and other assorted royal hangers-on were dragged by the crowd to nearby Tower Hill, where they were beheaded. Protesters also found John de Gaunt's son hidden in the tower. John de Gaunt had been a regent for the king while the king was too young to do to function as a king, and he'd been running the country more or less de facto king. John de Gaunt's son would be the future King Henry IV. Anyway, the mob were about to execute him too, but a royal guard successfully intervened on the prince's behalf and bravely stopped the execution going ahead. Anyway, the Tower of London was thoroughly ransacked by the crowd and valuable royal paraphernalia was taken away. And don't forget that this is where the crown jewels of England are kept, so this is very precious stuff. And obviously King Richard couldn't return to the Tower of London after the sack and the looting, so he escaped with his bodyguards to one of his lesser-known royal residences at Blackfriars. It seems that some of the conveners were unsatisfied with the offer of the charter that the king had made at the Mile End meeting. So they sent more messages to him to say they needed another meeting with His Majesty, this time in Smithfield, near the city walls of the City of London. So the next day, the king first went to pray at Westminster Abbey, probably to get spiritual strength. Then he agreed to meet with the appointed stewards and the chief organisers of the protests, this time at Smithfield, which is near where the meat market is. At this second meeting, the king met the main guy, a medieval revolutionary figure known as Wat Tyler, Tyler. His first name, Wat, W-A-T. At first, the meeting seemed to go quite well, and Wat Tyler treated the king intelligently and appropriately, although he was deemed to be a bit over-familiar, and according to some of the royal retinue, he was a bit rude and a bit brusque. Anyway, King Richard cordially agreed that the demonstration should have all that could be fairly granted, but it was only when Wat Tyler insolently asked for a pitcher of water to rinse out his mouth. And then he rinsed his mouth in a very rude and disgusting fashion before the king, said Sir John Newton, who was a sycophantic flunky, that Sir John started to suggest that Tyler was the greatest thief and the greatest robber in all of Kent. This caused a bit of a argy-bargy, and Wat Tyler lashed out at John Newton for this obvious insult, but was held back and was then arrested by the Lord Mayor of London, a William Walworth. Tyler then attempted to stab the Lord Mayor of London, but the Lord Mayor was saved by his armour. So William Walworth, the Lord Mayor, then reciprocated and slashed Tyler's neck and head with his sword, and another of the king's servants, probably a bloke named Ralph de Standish, stabbed Tyler again, this time severely injuring him. Wat Tyler managed to escape to ride a horse some 30 metres before falling off. He was rescued by a retinue of protesters, and in the mess that followed, Tyler was taken by his group to a nearby hospital for the poor. But the Lord Mayor, William Walworth, tracked him down and dragged him back to Smithfield and publicly beheaded him. Wat Tyler's head was stuck on a pole and carried across the city, where it was displayed on London Bridge, most likely near to the decapitated heads of Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Admiral Sir Robert Howell's heads had been the previous day. Following the death of their leader, Wat Tyler's supporters were driven from London and their protest movement was shattered. And subsequently Richard II revoked all the concessions that he had previously made and issued orders that many of the protesters should be hunted down and executed. And that effectively ended what history has called the Peasant Revolt. So what do we learn from this rather amazing story? Well, for a start, peasants could mobilise into a powerful and effective movement, and that peasants would unite around a political figure and a political ideology, and peasants would organise themselves to raise awareness of any issues they faced. And peasants were confident enough to challenge a king, an anointed king, and all his armies. And peasants could, and they would, take the law into their own hands. The history of the Peasants' Revolt, and it's a true history and it's a good narrative story, brings up some important historical questions. Because, do you remember, they demanded the end of serfdom. So what is serfdom? And it also brings up some contextual questions, such as, how did the peasants manage to mobilise themselves if we understand things correctly from history, they were just a bunch of illiterate idiots? And how could the peasants organise themselves if we've understood things correctly again, they were merely a bunch of downtrodden non-entities? And how did the peasants get the nerve and the confidence to issue direct challenges and claims to an anointed king if, and perhaps we've got it wrong all along, all they ever did was scramble around in the mud like a bunch of subhuman ragamuffins, saying things like, and I quote from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, "Oh look, there's some lovely filth over here." It's clear from what we know of the Peasants' Revolt that peasants were not illiterate idiots, nor were they downtrodden non-entities or subhuman ragamuffins. So, what were they? Now, it's pertinent perhaps to reflect that the Peasants' Revolt had several causes, but one major cause, and you'll find out in a moment why it's pertinent. The major cause was the social, economic and political tensions that had been generated after a global pandemic. The global pandemic was known as the Great Plague. We would now refer to it, looking back in history, as the Black Death, although at the time it was never called that. The instability that was caused by this disease demonstrated how weak and efficient the government was. It also demonstrated that there was a profound lack of leadership at the top level and also at local level. And the imposition of higher taxes that resulted from a long conflict with France during the 100 Years' War didn't help. But mainly, this Peasants' Revolt was a fallout from the global pandemic. During the Middle Ages, the majority of English folk worked in a countryside economy that fed the realms, towns and cities and supported an extensive network of international trade. Don't forget, this is long before the Industrial Revolution came along, and although there were some very skilled craftsmen who used to work in the local community, but most people worked in the fields, and they worked on a production system that was based around manors and that were controlled by local lords. And these local lords included the gentry and the church. And the system of government was managed through a thing called manorial courts. Now, it might be difficult for us to understand this, and I'm going to say something which you might think is outrageous, but most people liked being part of the peasantry. They liked being peasants. And there's obvious reasons why this is. In fact, if you think about it, it's logical. Number one, they benefited from gainful employment. They had a good home to live in. It was a cottage normally, and if anything needed to be repaired, somebody would come and do it. Food was on the table. Medical aid was there if they needed it. And there was even welfare systems in place that were normally provided by the lord of the manor that might include things like care for the elderly, care for the orphans, care for the very ill. And peasants were allowed to keep a little plot of land for themselves, for their own use. So peasants were tenant farmers. That's how we would define them now. And under Anglo-Norman law, almost all tenants were attached to the land upon which they served and were therefore considered to be villeins, villeins. And it's here with the word villeins that we start to confuse ourselves about the definition of peasantry, because villeins had much more rights and much more social status than slaves. They were above slaves, but they were not free men in their own right. And incidentally, the word villain comes from the Latin villanus, villanus, which means a man employed at a Roman villa rustica, in other words, a country house. So it's always meant a country worker. Because of the low status of villeins, the term has become derogatory over the years. When we look back, we might describe somebody ugly or naughty as a villain, but they were nothing of the sort at the time. But, like I've said before, from 1347 to 1351, the most fatal pandemic ever recorded in human history killed as many as 75 to 200 million people across the world. It was brought into the British Isles by travelling merchants, but this meant that any group of travellers, such as Jews, friars, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, and even Romany gypsies, were blamed for bringing the pandemic in, and they were attacked. The global pandemic had profound effects on the course of European history, and like I've told you, the pandemic we now refer to as the Black Death. One of the consequences of the Black Death, which was a plague, by the way, that killed 6 out of every 10 inhabitants of towns and cities, and about a quarter of all inhabitants in the country, so it was much more deadly inside a town or a city. But one of the consequences was that food prices fell, because there was more food to go around once half of the city residents weren't eating anymore, and land values halved. And owners, the landholders, these were the lords of the manor, faced great losses because of this. But for ordinary peasants, for the peasants who survived anyway, it must have seemed like a windfall. These survivors found that not only were food prices cheaper and food was more abundant, but also lands were more abundant too. And their services as farming people and as countrymen was now suddenly in great demand. Some lucky ones even inherited property from relatives. And all this probably destabilised a political system that was known as feudalism, and which had up till then kept peasantry in their rightful place. And that was downtrodden and bound by the lord of the manor. So we want to go back and ask those questions again. What is serfdom? How did the peasants mobilise? How did the peasants organise? And how did the peasants gain enough confidence to issue demands to their betters? So I'll go through those in turn. What is serfdom? Prior to the Black Death, serfs had a special place within a feudal society, as did freemen and barons and knights. In return for protection, a serf resided upon and worked on a parcel of land within the manor of his lord, and this was the manorial system. And the Domesday Book of England, which was basically a survey conducted by William I in 1086, says that in England, at that stage, the peasantry comprised of, in order of seniority, number 1 at the top of the list, freeholders, 12%, and those were the people who owned some of the land, serfs or villeins, 35%, These were the people who worked on the land without pay, but with protections. Cotters and boarders, B-O-R-D-A-R-S, about 30%. These were often the younger sons of serfs who lived in cottages and were allowed a little bit of land for themselves. Slaves, 9%, who had no rights at all, and the remainder were vagabonds and outlaws. To become a serf was a commitment, almost a holy commitment, to the lord of the manor. You would have to pledge truth, faithfulness and love to your lord. And don't forget that a freeholder, that's the top scale of a peasant, might be relegated to the second one down, serfdom, if he ran into debts or he was found guilty of a crime. This could happen to anyone, by the way. So a serf could be downgraded on the ladder to a slave, perhaps. A slave could be downgraded to a vagabond. And nobody wanted to be a vagabond or an outlaw. It was not a very pleasant place to be. Don't forget, it ranked under slaves. In fact, if you were one of these, then you could be killed on sight because you were absolutely worthless. If Robin Hood was, in fact, an outlaw, as the legends suggest he was, then he wasn't as respected as we'd like to think he was. The serf was expected to pay fees and taxes assessed by the amount of land he worked for himself. He was expected to provide the seasonal labour required for the lord when necessary. A serf was permitted to grow what crop he saw fit on his lands, and he was allowed to work whenever he wanted to, although a serf's taxes was often paid in wheat. So he would probably have to grow a bit of wheat because that's how they wanted the taxes paid. Any surplus he grew, he could sell at market. Now, the annoying thing about the arrangement for the serf was that he would have to sow, reap and dig his lord's fields at the same time that he would have to sow, dig and reap his own fields, because these things were seasonal. And on top of that, he still had to pay taxes. So it was quite a difficult balancing act to get all of the work done. And this is where a lot of the antagonism was caused. But of course, after the Black Death, after the peasant workforce was decimated, well, more than decimated, and peasants were in much shorter supply and land was relatively cheap and abundant, then their labour, the labour they could offer, was priceless. Because if a lord did not have somebody to come plough and sow and harvest for him, then he might become destitute himself. And if he became destitute, he'd go down the ladder and he'd fall into servitude himself, or at least his family would. So the peasants had to be appreciated and treasured by their landowners. It meant that sensible landowners relaxed duties and encumbrances on their peasants and provided them with the best of conditions. They organised fairs and pageants for them, for example, and they did everything possible to keep the workforce on their side. So how did the peasants mobilise? Well, it's hard to imagine how the peasants mobilised together to make such a potent force, a potent political force, if they didn't have any podcasts, they didn't have any mobile phones, didn't have any television shows, they obviously didn't have any Facebook, but worse than that, they didn't have any Royal Mail or newspapers either. In fact, most of them couldn't read and write. So how would a political system galvanise opinion and organise support? And how would they deploy a formidable protest group if they didn't have access to any of those things? How did they do it if they couldn't communicate as easily as we do now? They had something that most of us here in the West now anyway have given up. They had the church. Now, it would have been totally unimaginable to think about not going to church. And in fact, the Lord of the Manor not only gave you time off for attendance, but he expected you to attend church. In fact, they probably used to take a roll call. Attendance was required. Sundays were holy days of obligation, and incidentally they still are in the Catholic Church, although Catholics these days are slightly more relaxed about it. And don't forget, too, that everybody, because this is before the 16th century church reforms, was a Catholic. So everybody went to church, and they all listened to churchmen, like, for example, a bloke called John Rawe, W-R-A-W-E, who preached words of revolution from the pulpit. And of course, as you can imagine, churchmen, especially priests and especially people who were in monastic quarters, isolated inside monasteries, they were also hit and ravaged quite badly by the Black Death. So some good, ordinary, holy priests died of the Black Death. The more radical ones, the ones who kept marching around and walking around the country and becoming travelling evangelists, were the ones who survived. And in fact, many of the best and most exciting missionaries of this period were travelling evangelists. So they were walking from village to village, spreading the seeds of dissent quite efficiently. And where were the lords when all this radicalisation in churches were going on, you might ask? Well, they probably stayed at home, or they went to special masses at higher churches, cathedrals and the like, or many of them had their own private chapels within their grounds. They even had their own private priests, because the last thing that the nobility wanted to do was mingle with the unwashed hoi polloi. So how did the peasants organise? Well, when the dissident groups summoned representatives from villages, they started to march around, and eventually these marches snowballed into several thousand strong. And when it was several thousand strong, and this is people who are armed with things like pitchforks and other tools which they obviously used in the fields but which now became de facto weapons. When 1,000 people with pitchforks marched into your town, you probably would open the doors and let them in. And when they came into the town, they spread their gospel of resistance to the town folk as well. And most of the town folk also were suffering, and a lot of them had to pay high taxes, and they wanted to see serfdom abolished too. And so they were sympathetic to the cause, and they would join in. And this is how the rebellion snowballed into a very, very effective protest group. And how did the peasants gain the confidence to issue demands of their betters? Well, the peasantry weren't as downtrodden as you might think. They understood their own value within society, and they knew that if they withdrew labour from the fields, which they did when they started their march, then the crops would be left to die and wither in the fields. And if the crops died and withered in the fields, then everybody, even the high-ups, would starve. And of course the high-ups required a lot of tax money to support their wasteful military adventures and live their extravagant and luxurious social lives. So the peasants understood quite clearly that it was necessary to pay the taxes, but they only wanted to pay a reasonable amount of taxes. They didn't like the fact that the Archbishop was bringing in a special extra poll tax. And they liked working on the land, don't forget that. And they didn't even care about the idea of the tenure. They liked the arrangement, but they no longer wanted to be thought of as a possession of the lord of the manor. So try to remember all of these facts when you bring your peasant characters to life in your fiction. Don't forget that they were not brainless, they were not impotent, and they were not ineloquent. And also don't forget that they possessed power, and they were not afraid to use that power.